A voice like no other. You write in order to change the world. If you alter, even by a millimeter, the way people look at reality, then you can change it. James Baldwin. The first time I encountered Baldwin, it wasn't through a book. It was a video. A grainy black and white debate at Cambridge University in 1965. Baldwin stood at the podium, small-framed, dark suit, cigarette smoke curling upward, eyes sharp as razors. The room was packed. His opponent, William F. Buckley Jr., and Baldwin, he didn't just speak, he pierced. There was no shouting, no slogans, just that voice, soft, precise, trembling with fire, a voice that carried the full weight of Harlem, of exile, of witnessing. You didn't just hear Baldwin, you felt him, and not always comfortably. That's the thing about Baldwin. He never lets you settle. He wrote and spoke as if the world was on fire, and often it was. Racism, violence, hypocrisy, silence. He had seen all of it, lived inside it, but instead of turning bitter, he turned to language. He sculpted his rage into beauty and his sorrow into clarity. Baldwin was a writer, yes, but that barely covers it. He was a witness, a prophet, a moral surgeon. He dissected the lies of nations and individuals alike, and he did it with elegance. He did it with heartbreak. He did it with love. Not the easy, sentimental kind, but the kind that demands truth. And here is what made him different. Baldwin never wrote from a distance. He was always inside the thing. Inside the church, inside the skin, inside the riot, inside the silence of a broken heart. You don't read Baldwin to escape. You read Baldwin to wake up. In the next section, we'll go back to the beginning, to a boy growing up in Harlem, caught between the church and the street, and how that fire started. A childhood on fire. Harlem, the church, and the pen. James Baldwin was born in 1924 in Harlem. One of 9 children, raised in poverty in a neighborhood that carried both the music of dreams and the weight of survival. Harlem wasn't just a setting. It was a world unto itself. Jazz on the corner, sermons in the air, police sirens cutting through warm summer nights. It taught you everything you needed to know about America, its beauty, its cruelty, its contradictions. Baldwin's mother, Emma Burdis, was quiet and strong, the anchor of the family. His biological father disappeared before Baldwin was born. In his place came David Baldwin, a stepfather, a preacher, a strict disciplinarian, and a man who never seemed at ease with the world or with his stepson. The relationship was complicated, tense, strained by religion, by authority, by something unspoken between them that never quite softened. But even as a boy, Baldwin was different. He didn't fit. He was small, bright, curious, too sensitive, too clever. He was bullied in school and beaten at home. But he found refuge in language. He devoured books like they were bread. Dickens, Dostoevsky, Henry James, the Bible. He wrote poems, plays, essays in his notebooks like it was a kind of survival. And maybe it was. At the age of 14, Baldwin did something that surprises many people. he became a preacher. There he was, just a teenager, standing in front of congregations, delivering sermons with a fire and force that made grown men weep. For a while, it seemed like he had found his calling. The pulpit gave him power, it gave him an audience, and it gave him a voice. But Baldwin was already beginning to notice something dangerous beneath the surface, something dishonest, something performative. The way the church spoke of salvation, yet ignored suffering. The way it comforted those in power and scolded those who were broken. He said later, being in the pulpit was like being in the theater. I had no choice but to get out. And he did. At 17, Baldwin walked away from the church and from his stepfather, whose health was failing. The same year he left the pulpit, David Baldwin died in a mental hospital. On the same day, James's youngest sibling was born. There is something chilling in that moment. A death, a birth, and a boy who had just left behind God. Baldwin later said that his stepfather was defeated long before he died. He had inherited all of America's fears and none of its promises. This was Baldwin's early inheritance too, a world that told him to be quiet, to believe, to obey, and something inside him that refused. He didn't know where he was going yet, but he knew one thing. If he didn't write, he wouldn't survive. So he picked up a pen and never put it down. The exile begins. Baldwin in Paris. By the time Baldwin was in his early 20s, New York had already begun to crush him. It wasn't just the racism, though that was relentless. It was the suffocating weight of being a young, poor black gay man in a country that wanted him invisible, silent, or dead. Every door seemed closed. Every street a reminder. Even his talent became a burden. People admired his intelligence, but they didn't want him to use it. He later said, "You've got to tell the world how to treat you. If the world tells you how you are going to be treated, you are in trouble." But in America, no one was listening. So Baldwin left. In 1948, with just $40 in his pocket and the name of a single contact scribbled on a piece of paper, he boarded a ship to Paris. He was 24. No job, no real plan, just the need to escape. Not to find France, but to get out of America before it killed his soul. Paris didn't solve his problems, but it gave him space. Space to write, space to think, space to breathe. He lived in tiny, cold rooms, slept on couches, was often hungry, but he could walk through the streets without the weight of racial violence pressing on his chest. People still saw his skin, but they didn't see it with the same American hatred. They saw a foreigner, not a problem. And for Baldwin, that was enough, just to be allowed to exist. And in that fragile quiet, the words returned. In exile, Baldwin began shaping his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain. It was fiction, but barely. A coming-of-age story set in Harlem. A boy preacher, a stern, distant father, a yearning to escape the guilt, the shame, the fire. He worked on it slowly, painfully, rewriting entire sections by hand. It was his life, disguised as literature. In Paris, He also started to see himself more clearly, not just as a writer, but as someone who could say the unsayable. He began writing essays that didn't ask for approval, they simply told the truth. And sometimes that truth cut close. It was in Paris that Baldwin decided to write Giovanni's Room, a novel about a white American man in love with another man in Paris. It had no black characters, no Harlem, no civil rights slogans, just desire, shame, and unbearable loneliness. His publishers told him it would ruin his career. A black writer writing about homosexuality. It was unheard of. He published it anyway. That was Baldwin's rebellion. He refused to be anyone's representative. Not for Black America, not for the gay community, not for polite literary society. He would write what he had to write, even if it meant losing everything. And yet, in that isolation, Baldwin was never truly alone. He made friends with other black expatriates, Richard Wright, Chester Himes, Maya Angelou. He roamed the cafes of Montmartre. He argued, drank, danced, and read until dawn. He wasn't at peace, but he was alive in a way New York never allowed him to be. Paris didn't heal Baldwin, but it hardened him into something sharper, braver, and more precise. He had left America behind. But America was not finished with him. Fire in his bones, Baldwin and the civil rights movement. When Baldwin returned to America in the late 1950s, it was not to find peace. It was to bear witness. Something was happening, and he knew it. The South was burning. Black children were integrating schools under armed guard. Buses were being boycotted. The civil rights movement had begun. And Baldwin, now in his early 30s, could no longer stay away. He traveled through the South, notebook in hand. He went to Charlotte, Montgomery, Selma. He sat in churches, stood on street corners, spoke to organizers, mothers, students, exhausted men who had seen too many lynchings. The people there didn't ask if he was gay or what books he had written. They asked, "Are you with us?" And Baldwin was. But he was with them in his own way, not as a marcher or a preacher or a politician. He was a chronicler, a soul scribe. He absorbed the fear, the hope, the weariness, the rage, and then turned it into language, and even white America could not ignore. In 1963, he published The Fire Next Time, a short book, barely 130 pages, but it hit like a thunderclap. Part of it was a letter to his 14-year-old nephew. The rest, an unsparing analysis of America's racial sickness. It wasn't polite, it wasn't comfortable, but it was honest. He wrote, "If we do not now dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy recreated from the Bible, in song by a slave is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water. The fire next time." It became an instant classic. He was now more than a writer. He was a public figure. He appeared on television, debated segregationists, sat across from Robert F. Kennedy and asked, bluntly, why a black child should believe in American justice. Kennedy, rattled, had no good answer. Baldwin knew Martin Luther King Jr. personally. He marched with Medgar Evers. He argued bitterly with Malcolm X. He didn't agree with all of them, but he understood them. He knew they were all confronting the same beast, just from different angles. And then they were murdered, one by one. Medgar, Malcolm, Martin. Baldwin mourned them in his own way. He said their deaths aged him, that a part of him died with each of them. The America he believed could be better had killed its prophets, and now it expected him to keep believing. But Baldwin never lied, not even to himself. In a 1968 interview, right after King's assassination, Baldwin said, "To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time." That was his truth. Not rage for the sake of rage, but the rage that comes when you love something deeply and it keeps breaking your heart. He wasn't trying to burn the house down. He was trying to show people that the fire was already inside. The weight of the years, isolation, criticism, and unfinished battles. By the 1970s, the America Baldwin had tried to warn was changing, but not in the way he had hoped. The civil rights victories had been written into law. The marches slowed. The country congratulated itself. A black man could sit at a lunch counter now, but in the shadows, poverty deepened, prisons swelled, the dream cracked, and Baldwin, he watched the celebration with exhaustion. He was no longer the firebrand darling of liberal media. His sentences were still precise, still haunting, but now the mood had shifted. He was seen as too angry, too bitter, too radical. Critics began to dismiss him. Others accused him of repeating himself. The movement had moved on to newer voices, and Baldwin, who had given everything, was beginning to feel like an outsider in the very world he helped shape. And still, he wrote. He published No Name in the Street, a book of mourning and memory, filled with the ghosts of dead friends and a reckoning with the country that killed them. He tried to hold on to hope, but it was a quieter, more fragile thing now. Gone was the sharp fire of the fire next time. What remained was the heavy smoke of disappointment. Baldwin was also battling something more personal, loneliness. He lived mostly in the south of France by then, in an old house with stone walls, trying to escape the noise. He had friends, yes, many famous friends. Toni Morrison adored him. Maya Angelou called him her brother. Amiri Baraka respected him, even when they disagreed. But there's something undeniable about Baldwin's later years. They carried a sense of isolation. He never found the kind of romantic love he wrote about. He had lovers, yes, but love, the kind that stays, that holds you, that he never seemed to fully claim. There's something tragic about that. The man who wrote so beautifully about human connection often felt just outside of it. But he didn't disappear, not completely. He kept speaking, kept teaching. In fact, one of his final major public appearances was a lecture at the University of Massachusetts, where he sat in front of a mostly black audience and spoke about America with that same old clarity, and people listened. You could see it on their faces, the way they leaned in, the way they nodded, the way they recognized themselves in his words. Even when the world had turned the page, Baldwin refused to stop telling the truth. He said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And that was his life in a single sentence. He faced things unflinchingly, even when no one else wanted to. What Baldwin left us: death, legacy, and the light that still burns. James Baldwin died in December of 1987 in a small village in the south of France. He had cancer. He was 63. The world noticed, but it didn't stop. There was no grand parade, no day of mourning, just a quiet funeral in Harlem, where his body was flown back to rest. Toni Morrison, his friend and literary heir, said goodbye with a eulogy that felt more like a whispered prayer. "You gave us language to dwell in. A gift so perfect it seems my soul developed it without effort." What Baldwin left behind wasn't just a shelf of books. It was a way of seeing. He taught us that America's sickness wasn't just in its laws, but in its stories, in the lies we tell about ourselves, our past, and our innocence. He saw that racism wasn't merely a political issue. It was a moral and spiritual crisis, and he insisted that we could not heal until we faced it fully, fearlessly, tenderly. He gave us sentences like knives, paragraphs like psalms. He gave us rage without hatred. He gave us love without illusion. And he never, not once, let us off the hook. In recent years, Baldwin's voice has returned louder than ever. During the protests that erupted after George Floyd's murder, his quotes were everywhere, on posters, on social media, on walls. To be black and conscious in America is to be in a constant state of rage. I am not your Negro. Love takes off the masks that we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within. These are not relics. They are living truths. Because Baldwin saw all of this coming, he warned us, not with anger, but with grief. He tried to show us the abyss before we fell in. And even now, as we teeter on the edge of political division, cultural confusion, and moral fatigue, his words still hold. They still burn. Baldwin didn't leave a neat answer behind. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't pretend that hope was easy or that truth would save us quickly. But he did offer clarity. And sometimes, that's even more powerful. The precise role of the artist, then, is to illuminate that darkness, blaze roads through the vast forest so that we will not, in all our doing, lose sight of its purpose, which is, after all, to make the world a more human dwelling place. That's what he tried to do, and that's why we still need him, not as a saint, not as a slogan, but as a man who wrote like the world was ending, and maybe, just maybe, hoped it wasn't. Baldwin never wanted to be a hero. He didn't want a statue or a holiday. He wanted a conversation, one that didn't shy away from the ugly parts, the broken parts, the buried parts. He believed in the power of language to save us, not by softening the blow, but by helping us feel it fully. He once said that people are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. And maybe that's the work, to loosen the trap, to tell the truth, to sit in it, to name it again and again. There is something almost miraculous about Baldwin's life, that someone born into poverty, into oppression, into silence, could become one of the clearest voices of a nation. It makes you wonder, what else could bloom if only we listened more closely, if we didn't dismiss pain as noise, or exile those who speak it beautifully. James Baldwin is gone, but he left behind a roadmap, a mirror, and a challenge to look honestly, to speak precisely, and to love fiercely, even when the world doesn't love you back. Because as Baldwin reminded us, not all battles are fought to win. Some are fought simply to be human.